We have been at it now for 21 hours, and we've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms.
The U.S. delegation has now left Islamabad after unsuccessful marathon peace talks with Iran. Pakistan, though, vows it will continue to mediate between Washington and Tehran, quote, in the coming days. Iranian media reports Tehran is in no hurry to get back to the negotiating table. That's according to a source close to the Iranian delegation. And until the U.S. agrees to what Tehran deems a reasonable deal, they say the Strait of Hormuz will effectively remain closed. Well, CNN's Nick Robertson with more now from Islamabad.
So this is where we just heard from the Vice President. No deal on the talks with Iran over 16 hours, an absolute marathon session through the night here in the center of Islamabad. It is dawn now. When the talks began on Saturday, it was late afternoon, and we've quite literally witnessed the sun go down and then the sun come up again. And what the Vice President has said is that Iran, he doesn't believe, is giving that fundamental core agreement about its nuclear aspirations. He didn't say what happens next. He didn't talk about a specific end to the ceasefire. He didn't say if it's a return to war. But what he said the United States has done is given Iran its final and best offer. The ball, it appears, is in Iran's court to come up with answers now that it hasn't been able to through this marathon session of talks. The Vice President also saying that through the night he continually kept President Trump briefed and updated. He said that he'd come into these talks positive, but fundamentally the Vice President coming in looking, he hoped, to get a relatively quick solution. The Iranians with a much larger delegation and a much different negotiating style coming into these talks with perhaps the aspiration, as they have done in the past, of talking, drilling down, getting what they wanted. Fundamentally, also, the Iranians believe that they still hold cards, that they can still control the Strait of Hormuz. And to them, that is something that is leverage, real leverage, they believe, and that it could get more than they were offered here in Islamabad.
What else have you learned about these talks?
Well, Victor, the entire region is sort of on a knife edge at the moment following the failure of those talks. And the question, of course, that everybody is asking is, what does this mean? What comes next? Does this mean that the ceasefire is effectively over? Does this mean that we are going to see a resumption of fighting? That clearly a huge source of anxiety and concern here in the region. There are technically still 10 days left on the clock of this ceasefire. And Iran's foreign minister earlier had said, you know, we never expected this to be settled in one session. The fact even that the talks happened, Victor, the highest level talks to take place between the U.S. and Iran since the revolution in 1979, the fact that they lasted 21 hours, that they were, by all accounts, serious and substantive, all of that is a sort of positive indication. And yet, the fundamental chasm that exists between the two sides, the complete lack of any coherent overlap, particularly, as you mentioned, on the issue of uranium enrichment and Iran's nuclear program, and particularly, of course, on the Strait of Hormuz. That is leading to real doubts that it will be possible for the two sides to find any common ground. Of course, the whole world is now waiting and watching to see what President Trump will do when he wakes up this morning, how the U.S. will respond, and whether this ceasefire will continue, whether we might see another round of talks. And until we get some sense of the direction that this is moving in, you will continue to see, particularly here in the Gulf, where the Strait of Hormuz is such a crucial issue, a large degree of anxiety and concern. Although I will say, when you talk to people here, There were not high hopes for these talks. There was always a recognition going into these talks here in the Gulf that it was going to be a tall order for these two sides to agree on these very thorny and complex issues, Victor.
So let's bring in now Errol Lewis. He's the political anchor for Spectrum News and host of The Big Deal with Errol Lewis. All right, Errol, good morning to you. Let's start in the Middle East. Do you foresee that there are near-term political consequences of this inability to reach a deal in Pakistan domestically?
Good morning, Victor. There are near-term, but it depends on how you define near-term. We have elections, important midterm elections this year. Israel has elections for its Knesset in October. I think this is the last opportunity, the last political window to try and sort of put a bow on this and say this was a success or this was a failure. The voters in both countries will have the last word, but this is the last chance for these administrations to prove that this entire adventure was worth it, as the entire global economy, of course, is hanging in the balance.
Yeah, and we saw the economic numbers this week, the highest inflation rate, annual inflation rate for nearly 2 years in the U.S. Consumer confidence is low. Specifically on the vice president, because he was the new element here. We'd seen Kushner and Witkoff in their engagements with the Iranians before the start of the war. Is there any residual political impact for JD Vance specifically going in 21 hours and not coming out with a deal?
Well, you know, he's an interesting choice to lead the delegation in the first place. We know that he was a skeptic about the entire operation. And in his political past, he had specifically warned against doing exactly what this administration has now done. So to have him alongside a number of, frankly, amateurs, people who are not diplomats, who are not trained in diplomacy, who don't have the personal and professional experience and contacts to pull off something as delicate as this kind of a ceasefire conversation, he was kind of working, you know, it was all going to be uphill no matter what. So I personally am not that surprised that he came home empty-handed. It's going to take a little bit more work and probably some work by professional diplomats to try and get the ceasefire that the United States wants.
And I acknowledge that as I ask you this question, we don't know the answer, you don't know the answer, but I think everyone's waiting to see, well, what will President Trump do now? He did on Friday say that if there is no deal, that they're going to continue, the U.S. is going to continue attacks, and then on Saturday said, well, the U.S. has already won, so he doesn't care if there's a deal. What does he now say to the American people, that there is no deal?
Some version of declaring victory and coming home is really the only option for this administration. It's only a question of when they will do it, how they will do it, and whether or not more bombs will fall and more lives will be lost before that happens. But that is the inevitable conclusion. This president said from day one what he knew was the only politically acceptable answer for the American people, which is to say that this was worth it, it was important, it had to be done, and we won. He began saying that on day one, Victor, and the facts haven't changed that. And that politically, I think he and the Republican Party, that's all they can say. There's no other possible conclusion. The only question is, again, when they're going to accept that reality and get the best deal that they can and come home.
And what's your view of where we are now?
Well, clearly this first round did not work out, and perhaps there won't be any other rounds. I wrote prior to these negotiations that the most likely outcome actually was that there would be a no deal new status quo, one in which the U.S. nevertheless pulls out of this war. The Iranians continue to control the Strait of Hormuz. There's no agreement, but a new status quo is reached in which the two sides, the U.S. and Iran, do not go back into war. And then the question is what the Israelis will do. And the reason I wrote that is because the two sides are still too far away from each other on some of the core issues. The nuclear is, of course, one of them. That's the only one that JD Vance spoke about. But another critical one is the position on Lebanon, in which the Iranians are insisting that the ceasefire has to encompass Israel and Lebanon as well. And so far, it appears that the United States is pushing back quite hard against that, because the Israeli position is that they're going to continue to bomb that country, regardless of what happens between the United States and Iran.
Hold that thought. I'm going to come back to that. Let me just put to you what Middle East correspondent for The Economist, Greg Karlstrom, notes about these talks. And he says, on the positive side, this is the highest level diplomatic engagement between America and Iran since 1979. There is still time for another round. He also points to major constraints, including too many issues to get through in 10 days. And that, of course, would be the end of this current ceasefire, 2-week ceasefire. Significant psychological gap, he says, between the two sides, with each side believing the other is under pressure. How much do you think that perception gap is now shaping the trajectory of these US-Iran talks? And I wonder whether the positives, if you see any in it, suggest that there is still political will on both sides to keep diplomacy alive and not go back into this war. I'm speaking very specifically from the US-Iran perspectives as you see them at this point.
No, undoubtedly, there were a lot of positives. I mean, this is the first time you had the vice president speak directly to the Speaker of the Iranian parliament, who in effect is a much more important figure than the traditional Speaker of the parliament would be, given a lot of the changes that have taken place in the Iranian system. The fact that the Iranians brought such a large delegation, this is the largest delegation I've ever seen the Iranians bring, far beyond what we saw during the JCPOA talks, including the head of the central bank, which suggests that the Iranians were there thinking at least that there would be serious discussions about sanctions relief. So all of that is positive, and it's absolutely true. We're about 5 or 6 days into the 2-week ceasefire. So there's definitely time for a second, perhaps even a third round. And perhaps there is a psychological element in which neither side actually wanted to have an agreement right away, because it could give the impression that they gave in too quickly to the demands of the other side. They need to give the impression that there were some really, really hard negotiations, not just long negotiations. So it will remains to be seen as to whether there will be a second round or not. And as your correspondent pointed out, neither the Iranians nor the American side have said that there will not be a second round or that this is the end of the talks period. But having said that, I would say, though, I think the most likely scenario, nevertheless, is that they don't come to an agreement, but they nevertheless do not go back to war in the same manner that existed before this conflict, before this round of talks.